Hey class, hope this finds you well and safe wherever you are. Today I want to talk to you a bit about surround sound and spatial audio and immersive sound. So what I want to do is give you a little bit of creative background, a little technological background, and show you a few approaches. But also, given the current climate where you're not going to have access most likely to a speaker array, I want to show you a little bit about binaural sound as well, so some different ways you can use this approach at home. So with that being said, let's get started. Typically when we think about surround sound, we might imagine a 5.1 sound encoding for a movie or a movie theater, or maybe some sort of home theater situation. We might also think about sort of a multi-channel array, if anyone's ever heard the term quadraphonic, or imagine those old surround sound 8 tracks from the 70s and the 80s, maybe some sort of like Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon situation. Also, if you've been to a show at MPAC, you might be familiar with some of the giant speaker arrays at Studio One, or the Wavefield array that they have. And all of these are related, though they all have their own sort of unique history and technological approach. And if I was to break down kind of a taxonomy, I would say maybe the first one would be a traditional multi-channel speaker array, like a quadraphonic or an 8-channel situation. The next one would be a 5.1 or a 7.1 encoding for cinema. And the third, which has been around for a while, but really just in the last 10 years or so has seen a resurgence, is ambisonic and binaural encoding, which you'll see a lot in virtual reality as well. So what we're going to focus on to start with is setting up for a type of multi-channel array. Say you have 4 speakers and you want to set up a quadraphonic situation. And the nice thing about this is that if you have Ableton, if you have Pro Tools, Reaper, etc., it's fairly easy to get set up and get going. And I'm going to show you this in Ableton today, but the nice thing is that you can do this really in any DAW, and the techniques will translate. So let's jump in. Opening up Ableton, this interface might look very familiar to some of you, maybe a little newer to others. But the nice thing is that this program works on a very similar routing metaphor as something like Pro Tools or Logic. So rather than, if you hit tab, rather than this sort of linear view that you expect from a DAW recording situation, Ableton just has that mode here, and if you hit tab again, this will take you to what might look similar to mixer view in Pro Tools. So each one of these columns here refers to a different instrument, a different recording channel, a different routing assignment. So what I've done to set up for today is I have my computer plugged into a Mode 2 interface with 8 outputs. We're going to use 4 of them now. And in this situation, I'm just going to go Options, Preferences. You can see I've got my device set to my Mode 2 ASIO driver, but you could use a Focusrite, a UI, whatever you have. Looking at the center of these tracks, we see input-output assignment, exactly the same as what we're used to in Pro Tools. So I can click the drop-down. By default, everything is routed from the individual tracks into my stereo output over here. The interesting thing, though, when you're dealing with a multi-channel or surround situation, is that the architecture of a lot of these mixers, whether it's hardware, whether it's software, what have you, they're typically predicated on a stereo workflow or an aggregate of mono signals. So when we start thinking about trying to break this out into a 4-channel output or an 8-channel, or maybe we go to MBAC and we have something wild like a 30-channel, a 50-channel, we have to start thinking about where the sounds are coming from and how we're sort of conceptualizing getting them out of the system into the appropriate destination. So I want to walk you through a few approaches to this. And unfortunately, because the nature of recording a surround environment in stereo and the fact that I'm using my interface plus screen capturing, right now, sadly, you're not going to hear my signal, but we will have a visual indication, so hopefully this will give you a sense of the routing. And per usual, if any of this seems exciting to you or doesn't make sense, please don't hesitate to drop me a line. I'll include my email on the attached list of resources. So what I'm going to do is maybe I'm going to make just going to make a little test tone oscillator. So we see that this is actually generating a sound, and we see the signal here. Right now, the audio is routed out of the master, or sorry, out of this track, and then it's routed to the master, or main output over here, and by default, that's going to outputs 1 and 2. This, I imagine, is old hat for a lot of us, but if we're just plugging our headphones or our speakers into the output of our computer, that will default to 1 and 2. Same with Pro Tools, same with Logic, etc. If you have this plugged into an audio interface like we do now, that will just be the main left, the main right. So we see that here. What we could imagine if this is going to be a quadraphonic situation is that we would have 4 speakers, probably front left, front right, rear left, rear right, and those would have the channel assignments 1, 2, 3, and 4. So by default, if we click this drop down, we can either say, hey, we want you to come out of the front left and right, or 3 and 4, the rear left and right. We could also address these individually. 1, just go to the front left, just go to the front right, etc. And again, this will be similar for Logic, for Pro Tools, what have you. Going back to us first getting started routing in Pro Tools, you remember that you tend to bus your individual tracks over to the main mix. In this situation, we're going to typically disregard the main mix because that's going to bottleneck us as a stereo output. So we're actually just going to go, in its simplest way, we're going to look at the output of this channel. And I'm going to say, you know what, go to external out, and maybe I want the sound to go out speaker 1. So out, we'll say the front left. Let's say maybe, I don't know, maybe we have a drum loop, we have a sample. And granted, this will, I imagine, not be a great piece of music that we're making. All right, so now we can see we've got essentially 4 channels, 4 different sounds. One is this test tone oscillator. These other 3 are just loops that we have going. And this is a bit of a mess so far. So we notice that this one is actually routed directly out channel 1 on the interface, which will be front left. These 3 are still by default bussed over to the master. And that doesn't really help us if everything is being funneled through just 1 and 2. So at our simplest, we're going to say, okay, we'll take you to 2, which will be our front right. Send that one to 3, which will be our back, rear left. This one will go out of our back right. So right now in this arrangement, we've actually got a test tone going out one speaker and different loops going out of the others. And that could actually be really interesting. You could sort of walk around in the space, you could hear these different things emanating from different sounds, etc. And the thing we notice in this case is that the sounds are in their individual tracks, and this is actually not even touching the main mix. We're going to completely disregard the main channel strip right now. And again, the reason for that being that would then bottleneck us as a stereo output, where we actually want to be able to address 4 speakers. So this is well and good, but it feels a little bit clunky, right? Say we have some sort of piece where we have more than 4 sounds, or maybe we don't want to be constrained to this kind of 1 sound per speaker situation. Maybe we have, I don't know, maybe something like 7, maybe we have 20 different sounds, different tracks in our piece, and we want to be able to send them to different speakers. So the fun thing about this is, if everyone recalls their auxiliary sends and returns, another way you can approach this is actually using your sends as speaker destinations, as actual spatial locations to send the sound, rather than just an aux send for, say, an effect, though we can get back into that as well. So what we're going to do, we're going to get rid of these 2 sends and returns that we have by default. which were set up as a reverb aux end and a delay aux end. And in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to make 4 returns. And if you can imagine a hardware mixer with groups or outputs, oftentimes you'll see that arrangement. This isn't dissimilar. So what we're going to do is we've got our 4 sounds. Maybe to illustrate this, to make this not quite as neatly matching so we can sort of see what we're talking about, let's have a 5th sound. So let's say, all right, now we have 5 sounds that we want to distribute to 4 speakers. So what we're going to do, and we notice again when I made that one, that actually auto-bussed to our main mix, our master mix, which we won't want. So what we're going to do then is, rather than going directly at these channels, we're actually going to look at these 4 returns, and we're going to repurpose these as outputs for the 4 individual speakers. If we had an 8-speaker array, maybe 8 speakers in a circle, or maybe 4 high, 4 low in a cube, we would use 8. And again, this is the same approach you would use in Pro Tools or Logic or what have you. So to make this a little more legible, let's call this front left. This will be front right. This will be rear left. And this will be rear right. And so what we can do then is we're actually going to use our auxiliary sends as a way of sending our source material to the different speakers. So what we're going to do in our audio routing is, rather than going out to our stereo master by default, and rather than going directly to the external out through the interface to the speakers, what we're going to do is we're going to say sends only. We're going to say, you know what, don't go out the track, don't go to the main mix, only send sound if we route you to one of these sends. And what gets really exciting about this approach too is that you can start to make blends of sounds. You don't have to be as simple as, you know what, that drum loop goes there, this guitar goes here, this synthy spaceship sound goes only there. But you can say, you know what, I want this to come a little bit out of the front and the rear on the right side, and with just a taste from the front left. So what we're going to do, let's go ahead and get our sounds going again. We notice Ableton is nice. When you have a send only, it actually has changed the color of our metering to purple to show that it's sending sound, but we won't hear it because of the routing. And we notice the sound isn't going anywhere. Even where I'm sitting, I'm not hearing anything out of the speakers yet because it hasn't been sent anywhere. So in our most basic arrangement, what I'm going to do is send that to the first one. We notice that pops up in the send. I'm going to send this one to the second one. Boom. This to the third. And this to the fourth. And we notice something, and maybe some of the astute watchers here might have noticed that we actually have a problem over here still. And the reason for that is we actually notice there's all this sound coming through the master, which is maybe not what we need. So let's go and stop that. Let's go and stop that. What we want to do, right, is, because these are our destinations, we're actually going to want to hard code these to our external outs. So this one becomes front left, front right, rear left, rear right. And now that we've done that, we notice, boom, this is sending directly out to the speaker rather than to the master. This one is going to go there. This one to our rear left, and this one to our rear right. And the nice thing, though, is that we're not constrained by sources. Now that we have this fifth sound, we can say, you know what, this will also go to the rear, or the front left, rather. And we notice now we might have to actually, now that we're combining all these, we're starting to peak a little, so maybe we can bring our sources down a little for a bit of a better mix. So that's all well and good. So you can start thinking about assigning different things to different speakers without being limited by the tracks. The other fun thing about this, though, is that we can start to blend things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and remove all of these sources. Oop. And look just at this first test tone oscillator. So what we can do, going back to this idea of blends, I can say, you know what? Go all the way out of the front left, but we might say, hey, you know what? We want a little bit of that out of the back right and just a little bit over here. So we can actually really start to kind of sculpt these things. We can really place things in space. And we notice actually we've got sort of a blend of these. So not only can you think about mixing in terms of frequency response, like is there enough low end in the bass, etc., but you can really start thinking about sculpting physical space in this way too. And in a lot of the pieces I'm going to attach in the document, there's a long historical precedent of this. Cool. So that's well and good. But the one thing you might have noticed about this is that all of these sounds are still very static. We've placed them in space, but they're all kind of stuck there. Maybe the drums are always coming out of the side. That test tone oscillator is always coming out of that blend of the front left and the rear speakers. And artistically, you all might have different opinions of this. But you know, there is a trend, especially in the 70s when this first started hitting kind of mainstream. Again, if you imagine that kind of Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon type idea, where this very kind of obvious type sound, maybe, oh, it sounds like the footsteps are walking around, or, you know, maybe, oh, the sound flew by me. So you can be very heavy-handed with this, and, you know, that can be charming in its own way. But maybe there's more subtle approach as well. Regardless, though, what I want to talk about is not just placing sounds in static positions, but actually starting to compose with movement. So what I want to do is show you a device that comes with Ableton, and this is kind of unique to the Ableton package. But the thing is, there are very, very similar plugins with, again, with Pro Tools, with Logic. So you aren't necessarily married to this or missing out if you're not an Ableton person. But the exciting thing about this is this device right here is built to work with the send approach. So we notice when we've made this, this is kind of bound to our 4 aux sends. And as we move this, this will actually respectively turn up the aux sends to replicate that. So let's take a look. As I move this, if we look over at our returns, it's actually doing the blend for us. So we can actually do our kind of classic move the sound around the speakers type situation. And what's really exciting is all of this taps into the automation engine. So if I hit record and start moving these trajectories around, what we can do is actually start thinking about composing. We can play this back and we notice this will actually move the sound for us. We can really start thinking about composition, not just with sound itself, but with sound in space. We can start thinking about trajectories and movement and patterns. And again, there's a long historical precedent of that, and some of the pieces I'm going to send in the attached document will hopefully give you some ideas around that. All right, one last thing I want to talk to you about, though, before we move on, is how to reconcile the traditional use of auxiliary sends for effects, like, say, reverb, with this new kind of aux send as multi-channel output approach. So right now, we've got a sort of nice situation. We've got one sound, we've got a panner, so we can sort of move this. But let's say, what if we want a little reverb, a little delay on it? And in our traditional stereo workflow, what we would use, of course, is just these sends. As just, hey, let me turn that up and send it over to the reverb return, which would then go and get summed in the master, the main mix. In this case, though, since we're bypassing the master mix, we don't really have that option. So let's look at this, and it might seem a little kind of wild at first, but once you get the hang of it, it starts to become pretty second nature. So what we're going to do then is we're going to make a new return, and I'm going to color code these so they're a little easier to see. So let's say these first four are our hardware outputs, right? And let's say this one right here is going to be our reverb. So this can be kind of a traditional reverb aux return. And again, this might be familiar to you if you're an Ableton person. If you're not, I'm just dropping in a reverb. This kind of same thing you do in Pro Tools, Logic, what have you. So because it's in the aux, I'm going to make this full 100% wet. And we notice when I've made this, we actually have a fifth aux send right now. So our first four still map to our speakers. The fifth one seems to be open, and that actually we can use to send to our reverb. So if we turn up our sound, right, we notice this being sent there. If we turn up this fifth one, we notice just like we'd expect, it does route the sound over to our reverb bus and goes to our master, though as we know that master main mix is actually not being used for anything. So what we're going to do, this is going to be a little outside the box, but what we're going to do is actually go to this return. We're going to send this to sends only as well. And this can get a little scary because if you are not careful, you can actually set up a feedback loop. Which is, unless you're playing some sort of noise music extended practice thing, maybe not desirable. But in this case, we're gonna forge ahead. So we're gonna enable all sends, and Ableton just turns these off by default to prevent you from doing a feedback loop. But what we're gonna do is, if you can imagine the signal flow, is we're gonna route this to send E to our reverb, and then rather than this reverb return going to our main mix, what we're actually going to do is we're going to route this back to our first four sends, which then essentially takes that signal of the test tone oscillator, processes it through the reverb, and then spits it out in equal parts to all four speakers. And what's really nice about this, kind of artistically or creatively, is that actually gives you a bit of padding, a little spatial audio processing in the entire multi-channel space, which will then get a nice blend with this as you move this dynamically throughout this. So that combination of physical space along with sort of implied space or virtual space through audio processing can be a really effective creative tool. And as you dive deeper into this, if you so choose to, this combination of reverb, delay, spatial processing, maybe even more complex audio effects, you can get some really, really interesting kind of approach to sound that you wouldn't necessarily see as much in the traditional stereo workflow. And again, if this is something you're interested in, you hit any walls, you're curious about it, feel free to drop me a line. I'm happy to send you some more resources on that. All right, so hopefully all of this made sense, was of interest, maybe useful for you down the line. But I'm going to take a wild guess and assume that not everyone has a 120 speaker array at their apartment. So what I wanted to do is leave you with something that you can actually use now while you're stuck at home, if this is of interest to you. So in addition to ambisonics, a term you might have heard before is called binaural encoding. And what this is a technique for spatial audio predominantly aimed at headphone use, typically with virtual reality, maybe some sort of extended music, even ASMR if you're a fan of that on YouTube. And the way binaural audio works is it actually mimics the way that your head, your two ears, will hear sound as your head actually filters it, both in terms of volume and tonal quality. And it's based on something called an HRTF, which is an acronym for a head-related transfer function. And the exciting thing is that there's actually a lot of free plugins coming out that let you use this technology. So the one I'd recommend is actually by Oculus, the virtual reality company. And unfortunately, my OBS isn't capturing the VST window, but we can see it actually instantiated right here. And I'll attach a link, of course, on the document. So the fun thing you can do with this, because it's actually aimed for headphones, is that you don't really need to worry about routing to multiple speakers, about any sort of crazy aux-send stuff, what have you. You can still kind of keep your stereo workflow. So what I've done, just to demonstrate this, is I've made a little plug-in, little synth that's sending audio, and what I've done is I've attached my spatializer, and now I don't think you'll be able to see the actual VST window on the screen capture, but you can see how I have it instantiated right here. But the nice thing is you can actually keep your same stereo workflow and just place this inline as a processing effect. In Pro Tools, again, of course, you do this the same way. But even just keeping the stereo workflow, you see I've got an X position and a Y position and a Z position. So what you can actually do is place your sound, and if you're using headphones, you'll actually hear it fairly convincingly move around your head. And the nice thing is, again, you can actually automate this, change this the same way you would with anything else. So if you like, you can actually start thinking about composing spatial sound for home listening just with headphones. Yeah, I hope this was useful to you. Again, if you have any trouble, any questions, ideas, but you're not sure how to implement them, please don't hesitate to drop me a line. But I'm excited to hear what you come up with. Take care, y'all. Stay safe and be well. Bye.